In 2024, the Australia Institute's bringing some of the world's greatest thinkers to Australia to help celebrate our 30th anniversary. We're delighted to announce that Jose Ramos Horta, President of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Laureate, will be our guest in October. President Ramos Horta will be speaking at the Sydney Opera House on Tuesday the 8th of October at 6 p.m, 25 years on from Timor-Leste's historic vote for independence. Tickets are on sale now from the Sydney Opera House or via the link in the episode description.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America from the Australia Institute. I'm Dr Emma Shortis. I'm Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs. You might have noticed that we're a little bit late with the episode drop this week. We're really sorry to keep you waiting, but we hope that you'll think waiting for this guest was worth it. And it also allowed us to cover the fact that the AUKUS submarine deal is in the news again.
And today, in a world of growing uncertainty, this partnership has never been more important.
This is a demonstration that AUKUS is happening, and it is happening at a pace.
Well, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is launching a new memoir, Unleashed. And from the released excerpts, it sounds like he is unleashing on everyone.
I just think it's time for some of our dearest friends around the world to, prenez un grip about all this, donnez-moi un break. Because this is fundamentally a great step forward for global security.
This time, it's because former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has written a memoir, which is out next month and is also being serialised in the Daily Mail, because of course it is. In the forward sizzle for the book, it's been revealed that Johnson has claimed that the AUKUS deal was part of his plan to punish France, and specifically Emmanuel Macron, for the Brexit negotiations. Of course, we know Johnson is a serial liar and exaggerator, but given what we do know about the strategic justification behind AUKUS, which is that there isn't any, this checks out entirely. To channel Kamala Harris, this is not a serious deal, and the men who came up with it are unserious people. But even if it's only partly implemented, the deal will have really serious consequences. To discuss those potential consequences and to put AUKUS in the context of both the security of our region and American power, we're lucky enough to be joined by a deeply serious and generous leader. The Right Honourable Helen Clark ONZ served 3 successive terms as Prime Minister of New Zealand between 1999 and 2008. She then went on to become the United Nations Development Programme Administrator for 2 terms from 2009 to 2017, the first woman to lead that organisation. She was also the chair of the United Nations Development Group, and in 2019, she became the patron of the Helen Clark Foundation. To say that she is an active member of various international organisations, as her own biography does, kind of understates her significant and ongoing international leadership. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Helen, thank you so much for joining us here on After America.
Thank you.
I think it's fair to say you've been a fairly prominent critic of the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal, which has been in the news again in Australia this week. I wondered if we might start, if you could just, I suppose, outline, from your perspective, from outside of Australia, why you're so concerned about the AUKUS submarine pact.
So the debate in New Zealand is a little bit different from the debate in Australia, because Australia is a foundation AUKUS member with Pillar 1, which is about access to nuclear submarine technology. And that's raised a lot of questions clearly in the minds of senior Australians who've worked in leadership, defence, foreign relations, asking a question, is this really the deal Australia needs? They're looking at it, as I understand, from the point of view that you would have not a very large number of nuclear submarines, that there's no guarantee you'll get them at all, that your Collins-class subs are approaching end of life reasonably soon, that you could end up, in effect, subcontracting out your defence policy because of reliance on the American shipyards if they actually manage to produce them, or being relegated to hosting these submarines from the US, with US in effect controlling them. And even if Australia did manage to procure them in the end, it seems that they're very much thought of in the US mind as a force multiplier for United States strategies, which starts to really detract from Australia's capacity to have an independent defence policy. I'm certainly persuaded by the arguments of senior critics like Professor Hugh White that Australia could have a larger submarine fleet of a conventional variety and retain a more independent posture. So that's the kind of debate, as I see it, that's going on in Australia. Now, for New Zealand, it needs to be recalled that around 4 decades ago, we were ejected from operational involvement in the ANZUS alliance. We don't have a formal military alliance with the United States, and obviously no security guarantee. And actually, I think the way that's panned out has been quite positive for New Zealand. We've had what's been seen to be an independent posture in foreign policy, and we've been able to work alongside the US when we felt that it was important. We, for example, on my watch, committed SAS troops to Afghanistan and a provincial reconstruction team, but where we judge it not appropriate, we don't go near it. And the invasion of Iraq was a case in point. Now, the concern that I and those critical in New Zealand of what is happening have is that New Zealand is being nudged, guided, if you like, towards a much more operational, ongoing partnership with the United States and its strategies. And this comes at a time when clearly the United States' position in the West Pacific is under challenge. We have China as a rising power, also a power that both Australia and New Zealand, like much of the world, have a very substantial trade relationship with. And I think from a New Zealand perspective, looked at after decades of a rather independent foreign policy and defence posture, we're thinking, doesn't this prospect of engagement with AUKUS Pillar 2 position us rather more on one side than we would want to be? It's not that we're even-handed in terms of values. Clearly on democratic values, we know where we stand. But we also like to be able to make up our own mind in a range of issues rather than having it made up for us in Washington, D.C., Canberra, or anywhere else. And that's the concern about being led along by AUKUS. Now then, enter the issue. It clearly envisages rather larger nuclear submarine fleets in the South Pacific. I'm sure from Australia's perspective, they won't be nuclear weapon arms because Australia doesn't acquire nuclear arms, but certainly the US subs will be, and the British if they make it this far. So it does up the ante in armaments in the South Pacific, and that also rubs up against the notion of the nuclear weapons-free South Pacific zone. So many causes for concern down here in New Zealand. Also the kinds of capabilities that AUKUS Pillar 2 is foreshadowing. New Zealand would have access to more defence-related applications of quantum computing, artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, drones. We're sitting here thinking, hang on, what for and at what expense? What would this do to a defence budget? If we acquire these weapons, what's the potential use for them? So it really is a very uncomfortable feeling to be seeing New Zealand lured towards this arrangement.
It is, and I think it's so important that you raise that question of what for, because it's not one that's really ever directly addressed in Australia in terms of any defence acquisitions. What is this actually for? Who is it for? And of course, in Australia, AUKUS is quite clearly about China insofar as there is any strategic justification for it. The justification in the minds of supporters of the AUKUS deal is China. And certainly in Australia, people who are critical of American foreign policy, who are critical of AUKUS, are often framed as siding with China. as if it is a choice, a simple binary choice between siding with the United States or siding with China. And it sounds like that is reflected in some discussions in New Zealand as well. How do you think we can get away from this really overly simplistic binary view of our choices in foreign policy and try to chart a more independent course?
So this is where I found Hugh White's presentations in New Zealand particularly interesting, because he puts it in the broader framing of these two great powers in the West Pacific. The United States has been dominant in the West Pacific, and it's had its string of allies from Korea and Japan through Philippines down to Australia. Now, there's, of course, quite a lot of Southeast Asia, which doesn't line up on one side or the other. And as I understood Hugh's thesis, he says the US now does not spend enough to even contemplate retaining military primacy in the West Pacific. It's spending far less than it was on defence at the height of the Cold War. And the US is also very distracted. It's very distracted by the Middle East, not least at the moment. It's very distracted by Ukraine. It is a major power in our world. We've been used to saying for a number of decades the only superpower, but of course China's coming up. So the US is kind of, it's all over the place, and it's not spending and investing at a level that would enable it to maintain primacy quite broadly. And here we have China, which is clearly expanding its military capacities. And certainly we don't look forward to an Asia Pacific where there's no US and only China, and a lot of strings are pulled. So I think that the bigger issue for us, both countries, is how we position to try to maintain a dialogue with both partners, interact with both where it's in our interests, but also, as Hugh White suggested, perhaps more consciously build our relationships with Southeast Asia, which is, as ASEAN as a grouping, is much more used to navigating between the two sides than we have been when we've been in a slot of loyal little Western democracies, if I could put it that way. So it's really about how things pan out between these two major powers. And the last thing either of us would want is that it comes to war. Look, we're watching these horrible conflicts in other parts of the world. Can we not work diplomatically, through trade, through the broad range of relationships, to try to keep our region as one for peace and prosperity? I reflect back on my time as Prime Minister, which largely overlapped with John Howard's time in Australia. And that was when perhaps APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Organisation, was at its height. And we would all go, from George Bush, the Canadian PM, the Mexican president, Chilean president from the Americas, New Zealand and Australia, Southeast Asia, Chinese, Koreans, Japan, even seats at the table for Taiwan, Taipei, and Hong Kong. And the feeling was that the Pacific was a zone of prosperity and opportunity. And to see this flicked around now to one where great powers, are positioning even to fight it out, it's a very sobering turn of events. And I think we need to be thinking, how can we get back to that ambience we had before, where we were able to talk to each other, express our differences, but get on with trying to make the best lives we could for our peoples.
I think, it is at the moment hard to imagine getting back to that sense, I suppose, of community and building relationships, not least because of what you mentioned about the potential future role of the United States in the world, especially when it comes to China. It's one of the few areas, it seems, of kind of almost bipartisan consensus in the United States, a quite belligerent view of China that was evident even in the vice presidential debate that happened today. What do you think is at stake for our region in this US presidential election? What do you think are the implications of a Harris administration or a second Trump administration for our region specifically?
So relations between the US and China visibly soured when President Trump came to power. He weaponized the China relationship. But in all honesty, not a lot changed when the administration changed to President Biden. Hostilities continued, as it were. And, from time to time, President Biden and President Xi will get on the phone, and it's as if the adults were in the room, and, things would calm down a bit. But then, the wolf warriors and the Chinese Foreign Ministry and their counterparts in the US would be at it again. And it's been really quite destabilizing, I think, for all of us in the Asia Pacific. So I think we have some idea of what a return of a Trump administration will mean, sort of ramping up all of the above. We don't really know what a Harris administration would mean. What we know is the vice presidential candidate for Kamala Harris knows China quite well. He's been there as ordinary citizen, in his career. He will have views. I don't think we will hear much about that in the course of the campaign because, it will just be sat on. But I think that if Kamala Harris got a very different national security and foreign policy and defence team around her, you might see more creative thinking about how to manage the competition between the United States and China. And on that, I hark back to earlier writing of Kevin Rudd. He used to write about how to manage the strategic competition. And he believed it was possible. So a Kamala Harris administration might open the way to some more innovative thinking about how these two great powers are going to get on, rather than keep moving towards fighting it out. I mean, one of my concerns is that some of the moves in the US have very much looked like attempts to decouple the US and, by inference, Western economies from China. Well, I don't think that's a war we can win either as Western countries. Western countries' populations amount to almost a pimple on a pumpkin of the globe's population. The populations and the demography, the energy dynamism, it's in the global south. Now, the global south, by and large, is not taking sides. It's not wanting to decouple from China. In fact, clearly, a not insignificant part of it is overly dependent on China, and that has political implications too. But I think we just need a lot more, smart thinking about, what happens when a new kid comes on the block as a major power. How does the existing major power deal with this? How can we, out on the periphery of the Asia Pacific, contribute to debate and dialogue and trying to manage these relationships? I think that's the bigger question for us.
It is a really big question. I think your point about creative and smart thinking is one that can apply, of course, across the broad sweep of foreign policy and international relations. And of course, you mentioned earlier, the United States is very much focused at the moment on the Middle East, where there have been very concerning developments just in the last couple of days. You've made a statement in the last few days as well at the United Nations Security Council on behalf of the elders.
Resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a priority for our group since its founding by Nelson Mandela in 2007. A new approach is needed, grounded in international law. Council members who question the binding status of these resolutions or who use their veto to protect an ally or to oppose a geopolitical rival are eroding the Council's authority.
What do you make of the Biden administration's role there and how that conflict might be able to move at least towards de-escalation?
When I went to the UN Security Council on the 19th of September on behalf of the elders, I expressed a position which is one that's been built on for years by the elders. The elders, of course, began with Nelson Mandela as patron, and Nelson Mandela had a special place in his heart for Palestinian people because he saw their struggle for independence a bit like the struggle he led in South Africa itself. And if you go to Ramallah, you'll see the biggest statue of Mandela you'll see anywhere in the world with quotes about his support for the Palestinian cause. But the elders have always looked for a way forward that's based on international law and principle. And the substance of the statement I gave on the elders' behalf to the Security Council was that the Security Council and the member states of the UN as a whole need to be upholding Security Council resolutions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and be respecting and upholding the decisions and processes of the international judicial system, both the International Court of Justice in The Hague and the International Criminal Court processes. And of course, we've seen the resolutions of the Security Council, for example, on illegal settlements, or the call in June this year for a full, immediate, comprehensive ceasefire, more observed in the breach than in the observance, and more honoured in the breach than the observance. And we've seen, very senior member states really attack the international judicial institutions. This is worrying. Again, we don't quite know what a Harris or actually a Trump administration would bring towards this conflict. On President Trump, look, he's nailed his colours to the mast, clearly as a very firm champion of Israel.
If she's president, I believe that Israel will not exist within 2 years from now. And I've been pretty good at predictions, and I hope I'm wrong about that one. If Kamala Harris wins instead of the most pro-Israel president ever, which I have been already declared to be, you will have the most anti-Israel president by far, far worse than Barack Hussein Obama.
But he also very much values the relationship with the Saudis. And he promoted the Abrahamic Accords, which were about countries which hadn't made their peace with Israel, like in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, etc., freeing up and recognising Israel diplomatically. And the United Arab Emirates went down that road. Of course, Jordan and Egypt did many, many years ago. But Saudi Arabia has held out. And I think that their message to President Trump will be, look, we can't give you what you want until the Palestinians have a pathway to their state. So, President Trump actually doesn't like wars that much. His standard line is often, I could fix this tomorrow, it wouldn't have happened on my watch. So I do wonder what a Trump presidency would bring. There are very pessimistic views, which I heard expressed in New York when I was there over the past couple of weeks, where people think that a Trump presidency would open the way to annexation of the West Bank, which would be catastrophic, and of course dash any prospect of a Palestinian state. I wonder if it's that dire. Now, on the other hand, a Harris administration, what would it bring? It's said in the circles I was moving in New York that the Harris team is disconcerted, to say the least, about the way the US has managed its approach to what's been happening since October 7th. But nothing's going to be said in that vein during the campaign, where positions on the conflict will be weaponised. But again, with a different foreign policy team and some smarter thinking, it would be nice to think that a Harris administration might throw its weight behind the pathway to a two-state solution. So, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what either side would bring at the moment.
I think that's true, and an awful lot of speculation as well. Not all of it grounded in evidence. I wanted to just follow up and ask you about the role of Iran, because that has also been quite a focus in the United States in the last couple of days, especially about the deal with Iran that Trump nixed, and how you think the role of Iran might play out in this conflict, and how great powers like the United States might better manage that quite volatile situation.
Well, history will show that President Trump trashed the opportunity to have the nuclear deal with Iran, which was worked on painstakingly by John Kerry as Secretary of State, and by the Europeans who invested a lot of energy in it. Cathy Ashton, who was European foreign policy chief, just put enormous effort into this, but in the end it fell foul of politics in the United States itself with the change of administration. And we could have had a very different Iran, in my opinion, and I suspect the opinion of many. So Iran remained an outcast, as it were. Of course, it had a mildly reformist president in the Iranian context. And then when the next elections came and he hadn't been able to, soften Western attitudes towards Iran, sanctions still remained, economy under pressure, a hardline president was elected. But then a strange thing happened, and that was that plane crash with the president, or helicopter crash where the president was killed. And we've had new presidential elections in Iran with, again, a reformist candidate coming through. But this man really hasn't had a chance to show, what he would have liked to do to come back towards a rapprochement with the West because of what happened on 7 October and everything that's flowed from that, including quite recently the assassination of the senior Hamas negotiator in an Iranian government guest house, which is clearly extremely humiliating to Iran. And now the assaults on Hezbollah, which is Iranian-backed, in Lebanon, and I understand a senior Iranian commander has also been killed in the bombing there. And then you've seen, in the last, 24, 36 hours, the bombardment of Israel by Iran. And in a way, you have to ask yourself, how could Iran not respond? I think we're getting very one-sided commentary coming through where when Iran attacks, it's told the consequences will be terrible. But when Israel attacks, Iran and Hezbollah are told to show restraint. I mean, there's something not quite balanced about the reporting. I think most of us would just like it all to end and for diplomacy to kick in, the process to the Palestinian state to be secure, for the diplomats to be able to get back to negotiating the nuclear deal with Iran and so on. But as we sit here discussing that, we seem light years away from, talk, jaw, rather than war.
Unfortunately, I think, of course, that you're right. You mentioned there, Helen, diplomacy and the critical role of diplomacy. And historically, Australia and New Zealand are actually quite good at diplomacy, but we often, I think, frame international relations and these kinds of conflicts as beyond us, that we are middle powers or small countries and, we can't necessarily have an influence on these kinds of outcomes. It's up to the United States. Is that the right kind of framing, do you think? Is there a role for countries like Australia in New Zealand in this kind of conflict resolution? Does what we do matter?
It certainly matters, and I think in the particular conflict that we're talking about, there's a number of things that New Zealand and Australia could have done that they haven't done at this point. So, for example, I've been very critical of New Zealand government's decision to back the US-UK bombing of the Houthis in Yemen. Look, I've followed Yemen closely since I was at the UN Development Programme. I've visited the country. I keep contact with Yemeni colleagues. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been, bombing Yemen for years, never brought down the Houthis. So, the odd bombing raid from the United States, the United Kingdom, backed by Australia and foolishly New Zealand, isn't going to have the slightest dent on what the Houthis do with the straits that they're able to obstruct. And the reason for the obstruction of the shipping route, of course, was the attacks on Gaza. So again, all roads lead back to a Palestinian state. And rather than join in a bombing, which I can assure you will be futile, but will damage infrastructure and no doubt kill completely innocent civilians, doing that is taking us away from where our diplomacy should be focused, which is being part of a coalition of countries that will stand up and advocate for a meaningful set of steps towards a two-state solution. Now, the other thing I think both Australia and New Zealand could do, which they're not doing, is the formal steps to acknowledge the state of Palestine. That should not have to wait until the outcome of a peace negotiation. So, the formal exchange of ambassadors with a state of Palestine, not just, representatives to a Palestinian Authority. I think these are very important signals which we haven't yet sent. So we should be using our voice, in Australia's case, as a middle power, G20 country, important country. New Zealand is a small power, but one that's been known for taking a principled approach to issues. Seek out others who are concerned. In recent times, Spain, Slovenia, Norway have all formally, done the diplomatic credentials exchange with the state of Palestine. Why not join with Western countries like this, which are interested in moving forward, and start to get that drumbeat going for some meaningful talks?
That would be a really significant step, and certainly one that I hope that Australia and New Zealand might begin to take together. Helen, I am conscious that it's a dark and stormy night over there in New Zealand, and it's late. We've taken up a lot of your time, which you've been so generous with. So thank you so much for joining us on After America. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 2nd of October. And as we know all too well now, a bunch of stuff will almost certainly have changed since then. As you will have heard before this episode, Jose Ramos-Horta, the president of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Laureate, will be visiting Australia as a guest of the Institute in October. He'll be speaking at the Sydney Opera House on Tuesday, the 8th of October, and tickets are on sale now. You can find all of the details via the Sydney Opera House website or via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd be really grateful if you subscribed on your podcast platform of choice. You can reach out to us with feedback or episode or guest ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Or you can find us on Twitter @the Oz Institute. That's with an AUS. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and we'll be back next Tuesday. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.